This PowerPoint on addiction is specifically meant to be used if you are not attending class today or if you are using it for review. It will be much shorter than class. It will be missing out on some of the discussion for class. Be able to define addiction, learning theory, reinforcement, withdrawal, relapse, and classical conditioning. Relate addiction to learning. Relate addiction to neurotransmitters. List and define common addictions. We will cover a paper together in class. Let's look at types of learning. So we covered how learning works with synapses. Now let's look at more of a psychological way of doing this. So it's associating a stimulus with a response. Hopefully you've heard of classical conditioning. I hope it rings a bell. You have the unconditioned stimulus, as you see below this dog, and an unconditioned response, which is the dog sees the food and the dog salivates. That is an unconditioned response that will happen in nature. Before conditioning, you have a neutral stimulus, in this case a bell, and there'll be no conditioned response. Why would a dog do anything when a bell rings? It means literal to the dog. During conditioning, you have a bell was rung every time food is provided. So you get that unconditioned response because that unconditioned stimulus is present. But the conditioned stimulus has also co-occurred, and the brain learns that the conditioned stimulus means the unconditioned stimulus is present, and the conditioned response will then occur. That is classical conditioning, training to associate a certain cue with a negative or a positive reward. There's also operant conditioning, which is not really what we're covering in this class, but I just want you to know it. It's basically this trial and error where you do something, you realize it's a bad idea, and then you don't do it again. Like hopefully this coyote won't attack a porcupine again, and this blue jay won't eat a monarch again. Let's look at learning theory. So learning theory relies on the law of effect, which is, let's say you brush your teeth, and we're going to reward that behavior of brushing your teeth. We're going to give it two rewards. The first off will be positive reinforcement. So you've brushed your teeth, you get candy, which I hope doesn't give you cavities. But anyway, you brush your teeth, you get candy. Cool. That's a positive reinforcement. Kids tend to like candy. There's also negative reinforcement, which is the lack of something bad. So if you brush your teeth, you avoid cavities. And that of the drill, you don't have that in your life. That's negative reinforcement, is the aversion of something bad. Whereas there's also punishment. So not brushing your teeth means that you have to get your cavity filled. So that will reinforce in a different way. So that's punishment is going to reinforce that if you don't do the behavior, you're going to actually have something bad in your life. This is basically how reality works. We learn things, and it's necessary for survival. So very few of us would eat sand. Why? Well, at some point in your life, you probably tried to eat sand, and that was kind of an operant conditioning moment, and you learned not to eat sand. Many of us will brush our teeth. Why? Well, different parents do different things. So here we are at learning theory. But addiction hijacks that. And addiction is going to use the neural basis of how neurons work in order to kind of slide in and make something addictive. So what happens is you have your homeostatic state of the body where you have a neuron releasing dopamine and another neuron receiving it. And this is going to be that natural reward. Now you have acute administration of a drug here, and what happens is that neuron is going to release a super large amount of dopamine, and that's going to be a holy cow, what a reward. So bigger reward means more likely you're going to get an action potential, means more stimulation. It is basically like having a memory that definitely works as opposed to a memory that only works a little bit. It's an intense effect here. And what's going to happen over time is more neurotransmitters will be needed to get that same effect. And the body will end up balancing this out, either by creating more neurotransmitter receptors or by just releasing fewer neurotransmitters under normal conditions, because that super effect is not something the body really intends to happen. So these addictive molecules cause an increased release in neurotransmitters, and the body will counter that in a way, one way or another. And that's going to be your addiction phenotype there, which means that weak signal that is normally weak becomes very much stronger, and over time, your body will change the number of receptors or change the amount of neurotransmitters released. So certain things, like addictions that feel very positive, like meth, sugar, yes, sugar, and heroin, will hijack the pleasure pathway that is made for learning normal, good foods, sex, and positive social interactions. These are things that are needed for survival. The body does need to get good food in its body to survive. Yes. And sugar hijacks that. The body needs positive social interactions to be a social creature and needs sex to make more of the same species. So these are the normal pathways that are normally feel pretty good. Instead, you get something like heroin or meth, which is going to be very similar to that, but hijack the same pathway. You feel good, but it's not because of something that helps you survive. And over time, a greater level of dosage will be needed to get the same level of high because the body does adjust to things. And in addiction phenotypes, the higher level of dosage will be needed to even feel normal. So what this means is that someone who does not take a dose of that chemical is going to feel actually worse than before they started taking that chemical. This is why some individuals feel it's necessary to take painkillers even just to live if they are already addicted to opioids or other painkillers. Or meth becomes necessary to even get out of bed in the morning. At this point, you are in a withdrawal phase. There is a very good YouTube clip here, and I recommend you watch it. It's about 3 minutes long. Pause me, watch it, come back. Notice that there is positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement shown in that video. The good feeling is that positive reinforcement. The lack of a bad feeling is the negative reinforcement. So this can lead to something called a relapse, when withdrawal symptoms induce a return to the addiction behaviors like taking the drugs. There's also a certain long-term prognosis which is different for different drugs. Remember that not all drugs can just be taken, oops, I got addicted, switch it off, recover, and be back to as good as before. Some will have long-term negative effects. We're going to discuss in class what it means to hit rock bottom. Part of rock bottom is acknowledging harm to the self and acknowledging what has been done and that this is not the way you want to be alive. But also acknowledging that you are unable to currently stop. And this is a good moment to actually involve others in your prognosis. In class, we are going to be looking at a separate PowerPoint with a separate paper and looking at and discussing when cell phone addiction is actually occurring or when people are simply very reliant on their cell phones. And we'll also be talking about different ways to get help. I have discussed with students in class their various smartphone addictions, and students have told me that they need help. And because we are dealing with a population that includes several addicts, it is a good decision to think about getting help. If you're watching this outside of class because you decided that you did not want to attend lecture, since I said no smartphones in class, and you just felt, I can't do that, this would be a good moment to ask, why can't I do that? Is it because I have someone who needs to contact me right now? Okay. But if you are having smartphone addiction problems, this is a good moment to start thinking about getting the help you need and the mental help you need for a good bit of mental health. And that's good for your brain.